Today I'd like to continue our discussion of chapter 23 of the book of Deuteronomy. This section of Deuteronomy is talking about certain laws and customs that the Jewish people embraced. Some of them were actually embraced while the people were on their journey to Egypt, and Moses revealed them. Others seem to come from a later time when the Jewish people were settled in the Promised Land, and different occasions arose in different circumstances, and people said, well, we need a law for this, we need a law for that, and so they became established as part of the Mosaic tradition, although probably from a later date. One of those would be with regard to the temple, and that law was that there should be no temple harlot among the Israelite women, nor a temple prostitute among the Israelite men. So you can see that would have been obviously from a later time, because during their time of journey, there were no situations where there would be a temple harlot. That was a custom that came later on as the Jewish people were settled in the Promised Land. And as they were settled there in the Promised Land, you would notice that different religious traditions would arise among the people. And they would encounter various gods and goddesses and practices, and they would have to decide, well, is this practice maybe compatible with my acceptance of the Jewish faith and the Mosaic tradition? Or is this a practice that really I can't really engage in? And of course, when you're in a situation where you're surrounded by neighbors who have different religious practices, the tendency is to maybe go along with some of those practices, just in terms of friendliness, social gatherings, wanting to get along with others. But the idea of a temple harlot was when you went for worship at some of these temples, there was a woman there or a man, and you could have intercourse with them as a sign of your kind of faithfulness to this particular god or goddess, and you would pray for fertility and fruitfulness, and that practice was an accepted practice in the Canaanite religion. But the Mosaic tradition was, no, this is not a good practice. And of course, part of that practice is you're really giving then worship to another god other than the God of Israel. And so obviously it is to be rejected. Also, one of the customs that came down was that you should not offer a harlot's fee or a dog's price as a votive offering in the house of the Lord. So to do that would be to equate the worship that you're offering God with the same thing that you're doing with a harlot or with a dog, and so those fees should not be the same as the offering you give to God. And again, the idea was not to mix these religions and these practices. And you can see how that could happen. If there was a certain fee that was offered in the Canaanite religion, or a certain fee that was offered in terms of the culture of the time with regard to a certain animal, and you equated it with God, it could be very confusing. Are you really worshiping God? Are you giving the best to God? Are you offering what you should offer to God? Or are you kind of mixing it with something that is happening in the culture in Canaan? And so you want to keep those two kind of separate. The next law, custom that evolved is a very interesting one. You shall not demand interest from your countrymen on a loan of money or food. And this prohibition against interest was a very controversial teaching, particularly as different systems evolved in terms of banking. Well, if I'm going to loan you money, I'm just not going to give you the money. I'm going to, want some return on my money. Uh, and so there was this idea of, well, this prohibition about interest, is it an absolute prohibition, or is it something that we can kind of change around a bit, alter a bit? And so that became the discussion about interest. The idea behind this, though, is really a beautiful idea when you think about it. You know, if you're giving money to somebody, they're in need, you're helping them out, you shouldn't be asking for a return on that money, should you? But of course, when it's taken out of personal relationships and it's put in the context of a bank, an institution that has to employ people and has to pay their salaries, that type of thing, you know, it becomes a different issue entirely. And of course, at this time in the Mosaic tradition, they weren't really thinking about that concept. It was more you went to a fellow in the town and you said, you know, I need money for my farm, I have to buy an animal, I need money to buy feed, that type of situation. Can you loan me it? And then in the spring, when there is a return, I will pay you back. And the person would say, fine, and there would be no interest involved. Also, in terms of food, if the person needed food, you know, you really shouldn't be charging an interest. They need this for their survival. But then, as the traditions and economy evolved and banks became more established, it became a different reality. And so the teaching has changed over time in terms of interest. And it shows you that some of these teachings that we see in the Mosaic tradition are certainly not absolute teachings, particularly those issues that would be more peripheral to the people. I mean, this is not a central tenet of faith. So a lot of these customs evolved, and there was a good reason for them at the time. But then, as the situation changed, then also, of course, the teaching was adapted. Interesting, though, you couldn't demand interest from someone who was a fellow country person. But if the person was a foreigner, that was a different situation. You could demand interest from a foreigner. And again, why would that be? Well, again, the foreigner, maybe they were a traveling type of situation, and so you needed that money, that extra money that you would get from the interest, and that would be important that they would pay that back. Whereas the countryman might have even been somebody who was related to you. There was this bond. And so a different situation entirely is how it was viewed. Then they get into the law about making vows. The making of vows was a very important part of Jewish religious practice. And the law with regard to that is if you make a vow, you should fulfill that vow as quickly as possible. A very important teaching that when you make this type of solemn promise, it's something you should take very seriously. It's not something that you just are flipping about or casual. You're making a vow. And part of making a vow is making a promise to God. A lot of the vows were sworn in a religious context. And so you wanted to fulfill that vow. And even today, of course, in our own religious traditions, vows are very important. They should be taken very seriously. And it's important that we fulfill our vows.